Okay, so we're back with part 2, lesson 12, part 2. So I've restarted my Express server. So things are still running here. Here's my API. And my Angular homepage is running. It's loading our food component. So we've actually created 5 of the 6 layers that we need. We have our server backend. We have our Angular front end. We'll obviously have to make changes to the Angular front end and the component. So the key now is the interface layer, the bridge. So this is an Angular service. So this service is what's going to allow our Angular component to interact with our Node API on the back end. We need kind of a bridge for this. So in my command window, again, just going to stop my Angular service for a minute. Now I'm down in my app folder. So what I want to do is I'm going to create a new folder here called services, and then I'm going to generate a food service. So I'm going to make a directory, or I could do this in WebStorm. I'm going to make a services directory. And this is inside of my Angular app folder. I want this to go. And then I'll change directory, go inside my services, and I want to run the service generation with ng generate service food. So it's created food service.ts. Okay. Then I can go back up one level and run my server again with ng serve. Put my Angular server back online. So now I've got under app, I've got a services file. Okay, so things are still running here on the server end. Now, in order for our Angular component, for our service needs to make, so our service is this bridge, is this interface between the Express API and the Angular component. So it's going to need to make HTTP calls to our service. So in order to do that, we're going to have to add the Angular HTTP client library. So I'm going to open up my services, my food.service.ts, and I'm going to need to import the HTTP client comes from the Angular library, Angular common/HTTP. Without this, we can't make calls. Then what we'll need to do is inject this service into our constructor. So we're using dependency injection. So when our Angular component runs, it needs an instance of the Angular service. And then we'll use this HTTP client object to be able to call the Express API and return fetch our JSON object. So now inside of our service, we've got a constructor, and we're going to add, our constructor has a parameter. It requires an instance of this HTTP client. So whenever you create an instance of the service, it's going to invoke and instantiate an instance of our client. Now we can write a get method. So we're going to call this get foods, plural. And what we'll do is make an HTTP GET request to our Express API. So when this service, this will run, this is going to call our get method and return our food. Now, eventually, rather than hard code this URL, we'll read it out of our configuration file. We'll leave it hard coded for now. We'll get it to work, and then we can modify it. Okay. So now we're going to also have to configure our service in our app module.ts. So we've already referenced our component. We also now need to import our food service. And in our providers, we're going to list our food service. So this service is going to be providing data to the front-end components. Okay. So we're almost there. What we now need to do is work with our food component. So if our service can talk to our Express API, our food component now needs to talk to the service. So here's what's going to happen in our food component. Our food component needs to reference our service. And then whenever this component gets created in this initialize, we need to use dependency injection, like we did in our ASP.NET class, to create an instance of our service. Okay. So if we look at the service file, notice the first thing we've got, the first dependency that's automatically here is that's injectable. So that means we can inject this class as a dependency of our component. Now, when our service fetches the data, this runs asynchronously. So that means the service has to wait to get data back from the API. So our GET request, it can't respond right away. So we're going to use some kind of asynchronous method to do this. We've got an option of a callback, a promise, or an observable. We're going to use this observable library, and we're going to have to add a few references in here in order to make this work. Okay. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to import our service. So our component can use our service. And it will automatically get the right path. So in our constructor, we're now going to change our constructor. Constructor now requires food service be injected. Instead of an empty constructor, now whenever you create the component requires an instance, a running copy of the food service. Create a foods property to hold the list of foods. And we'll just declare this as type any. In TypeScript, if we declare a property, it's got to have a type, but we can say it's any. It's just a list. And then we can write simple getFoods method. So this is going to use the service, fetch the food list from the server API. We'll say this dot food service, and now we can call the get method in our food service. The get method in our food service talks to the server API. And we're going to, because this runs asynchronously, we're going to subscribe. We're going to wait for a response. And then when we get it, we're going to set this dot foods equal to our response. Okay. So we're going to call the service, call the get method, wait for the JSON to come back. And if we get that JSON, we're going to populate our foods property. We also want this to run. We want to get the list of foods automatically when this component started. As soon as our food page loads, we want to go talk to the service, which talks to the API, which will go and fetch our food. Now we've got this dot. We want to call our getFood method here. So let's see what happens now. Now notice, suddenly my title's gone. So let's see what happened. If I go to my, so this is trying, this code actually tries now to fetch the data from the database. So what happens? Okay, we're getting a no provider for HTTP client error. So let's see why. So it's saying we're missing a provider. So we've got our HTTP client in our service. We need one more thing in our app module. We're also missing, we need to add one more reference. Our main module also needs this reference. It needs the HTTP client module reference. We can't make calls without this. So in our list of imports, we have our browser module, we have our app routing, we also need our HTTP client module. This should make this error go away. So now our main Angular module can make HTTP requests. It's not enough that our service can make it using HTTP client. We need this HTTP client module library as well. So now, okay, now you notice our title is back, but we still don't have any data, and there's an error, another error here. And this error is actually to be expected, saying a cross-origin request is blocked. So because this server runs on localhost 4200, our localhost 3000 saying these are different domains. So our API is not allowing these requests. So we're going to need to make a small change in our API in order to permit requests to come from localhost 4200. So I'm going to go back to my Express controller. And we're going to allow controller to accept cross-origin requests localhost 4200. So we'll have the router.use method. We're going to set some headers. Our response headers, first of all, we're going to allow control, allow origin. I'm going to allow this. I'm going to allow requests from localhost 4200. I'm going to allow headers, origin, X requested with, sorry, it should be, and content type, accept. And lastly, we're going to set up what methods to allow. And the methods we want to allow are get, post, put, delete, and options. We're going to allow any one of these HTTP methods. And then lastly, we're going to call next. So this way, this check is going to run before every request. So I'm going to try explicitly allowing this. If this works, then once we get this working, we'll probably want to move these hard-coded domains out of the files we've also got in our service. We'll want to move those to the configuration file instead. So now we notice that CORS error, that cross-origin. Okay, it did come back. Let's see. CORS header access control allow origin is missing. Maybe I mistyped something. Let's just check. This is access control allow origin. Try one more time. Okay, so our cross-origin error goes away. So now Angular should have access to actually display the JSON data. So in our HTML page, I'm going to build a table and use an Angular loop to output our list of food. So I'm going to go back to my food component.html. We'll create a table. So we'll have name and country as our headings. And then we can use our Angular each. Let me just double check my syntax. we'll use ng4. I need to put this in. Should actually be a tr tag. Make a new row. And then in here, we have food.name. And food.country. So we'll have a look at this. This should now populate our table, which it does. My table CSS isn't quite right. We'll see why. Okay, I won't worry too much about why my hover is not here right now. So there's we can read data. So we've now gone through all 4 layers. We have our API on the back end, our Angular service, our Angular component that when it gets initialized, fetches the list of food from the service, waits for a response, and then populates our food variable, and our Angular loop in our HTML that goes and fetches. Now I want to move. I've hard-coded this URL in, so I'm going to add a couple of I'm going to add these URLs to our config file. So inside our globals.js, I'm going to add here an API server variable, which will be localhost 3000. I'll also add client server to be localhost 4200. And rather than hard coding in these 2 URLs to the code, I want to read them from the config file instead. So in my foods.js, I want to replace this. So in here instead, I'm going to use my config dot client server. I'm allowing requests from localhost 4200, but this is now, rather than being hard coded into the controller, it's being read out of the configuration file. I want to do the same in my service. rather than hard code in this URL, I want this to be a variable. So in my service, I'm going to go all the way out. I config the 4 folders up. Okay. Oh, actually, let's see how we want to do this. Okay, we'll use import this way. And now my URL is going to be this. Config dot. Okay, I'll have to come back to this one. Let's think about how to do this properly in my service. Take it out for now. We may come back to that. So my page still runs. So now what I want to do is I want to add a form where I can add a new food and have it automatically appear in my list. So in order to do this, first of all, we're going to want a drop-down list of the for the moment, we'll use a text box just to keep it simple. So in my food component, at the top, we'll add a section maybe with a small heading. We'll say food. And we'll add on a label and an input. Say it's required. At the moment, I'm just going to add the country as a text box. If we have time, we'll add it as a drop-down. And then I'll add a button One of the interesting things about Angular is we don't actually need a form tag because we're not going to submit to another page. When we click the button, we're just going to call a method. So our page will reload. And now we actually get a form. So what I want to be able to do is add a food and have it save my form clear out and our new food be added automatically to the list without our page ever having to reload. So we're going to need 3 different methods. We'll need a method in the Node API. We'll need an add food method in our component and an add food method in our Angular service. So let's start in the back end, in the Node end of things. We're going to set up, we don't need a separate URL. We're always going to be on the same URL. But in this case, we're going to have post method. So in this case, what does our post method look like? So we will use the food model, save the new food. We'll call food.create from our request body. We don't have to map the fields. Mongoose will do this automatically, and we're either going to get an error or a new food back. One of these 2 things is going to come back. If we have an error, we'll log the error. We'll return JSON response showing the error status, and we'll give it 501, which is the status. We could put in not implemented, so we could not save. Otherwise, we'll return our new food with the status of 201, which is created from our list. New resource created. In a comment. So there's our first layer on the server. We're going to take the request body, use Mongoose to try and create a new food, and if it works, we'll return a 201 status. So now we need to set up our service to take the name and country and create a food. So let's go to our service. So we're going to write an add food method in this case. So our add food, we're going to need, because this method is going to accept a JSON object in, we're going to need HTTP headers. So in the service, set this up. So we'll going to use HTTP headers object, and we are going to append on to those headers content type. We have a sticky key. So all our headers, we're going to put in the content type as JSON. For telling our application any request that comes in, we'll have a JSON header. So now in our add method, we're going to return, we're going to call post. So this time we're going to make a post request to the API, same URL /foods, but we're also going to send in a new food object. And lastly, we need to set our headers. So we've got to say, hey, this request is JSON. So there's our service. We're creating a HTTP header and setting the type to JSON. And when we go to add a new food, we're going to accept the JSON object in. We're going to submit the post method and pass that JSON object to the server API. And we're also setting the header type as content type equal to application JSON. So there's our service. And now we have to write the code in our food component that will call the service. So I'm also going to set up some additional properties. Our food is going to have an ID, which MongoDB will create as a string. We'll have a name. We'll have a country for each food. So now we want to write an add food method, which is void. It doesn't return anything. We'll create a new food. We'll say name is equal to this dot name. So whatever is in our Angular front end. And country is equal to this dot country. So that's going to come from our name and country. We're going to use ng model tags and two-way data binding here. So in our food component, we're going to create new food from the UI. And then we want to call the service. Call the service, which calls server API. So we'll use our food service, and we want to call add food. Pass in our new food. And then we're going to use a method called subscribe. We're going to wait for this to run asynchronously. We're going to wait for a response. And once we get a response back, we want to then call our get method. We want to refresh the food list. And lastly, we want to clear out the form. We're going to create a new method called clear form. We can add that. All that we're doing here is setting this dot name and this dot country equal to null. That will clear out the form. But after we save, we want to refresh the list. When done, refresh list, clear form. So we now need to do 3 things in our HTML page to get this to work. I can go and fill out the form right now, but nothing will happen. We go back, test. So test and USA. Nothing actually happens. So our 2 inputs need ng model directives, and our save button needs an ng click event handler. So when it's clicked, it will call the add food method of the food component, which will populate the name and country from the form, create a new food and pass that to the service. The service will post it to our API. Our API will try to create it in MongoDB and send back a JSON response. And then we'll refresh our list and clear the form. So our inputs, these need ng model. So our first ng model is the name. Now I'm getting a warning here. It's saying you can't use ng model. We actually had this happen last week. It says you need to import the forms module. So our Angular component needs the forms module. So I could either add it here, or I could just use the code hint. I'll click on import forms model. It now imports the forms model in my app.module.ts, imports it here. So now I can use ng model. And for country, we're going to bind it to country. And then save, we're going to call add food. Okay, so let's try this all out now. It should be set up to work properly. Oh, still compiling my change. So we'll wait for this to finish. And we'll try and add something new. Now if I add a food, notice my form clears out and my list refreshes automatically. So there's no reload. The data is always real time. So we're partway there. We can now read, we can add. We also want to be able to edit and delete. So I'm going to take another break here, go brew a coffee, and I'll come back in about 10 minutes. I will push what I've done to GitHub so far, and then we want to put edit and delete links here. Delete will simply remove the item with a confirmation, and edit will populate the item into the form where we can save changes, and then update, which will refresh our list and clear our form. So we'll come back shortly and do that.